"You're not as innocent as you pretend," she said softly, and in that moment, I realized she had been watching me far more closely than I ever imagined. The first time I noticed it, nothing had really changed, at least, not on the surface. It was the same living room I had walked into 100 times before. The same worn couch, the same quiet hum of the ceiling fan, the same late afternoon sunlight slipping through the curtains and settling in soft lines across the floor. It should have felt familiar. Easy. But it didn't. Something in the air felt slower. Heavier. I told myself I was imagining it. She was in the room, moving about the way she always did, calm, unhurried, completely at ease in her own space. There was nothing dramatic in the way she carried herself. No sudden changes. No obvious reason for my chest to feel tight every time she stepped a little closer. And yet, I noticed everything. The soft sound of her footsteps as she crossed behind me. The faint scent of something warm and clean when she passed by. The way her voice seemed quieter when she spoke to me directly, like the rest of the room faded just a little. I tried not to look at her too much. Tried, and failed. Because every time I did, even just for a second, I had this strange feeling that she already knew. Knew what, exactly? I couldn't have said. That was the problem. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small ones, stacking quietly on top of each other until I couldn't ignore them anymore. Like the way her gaze would linger, not long enough to be obvious, but just long enough for me to catch it. Not curious. Not judging. Just aware. I remember sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing in particular, pretending to scroll through my phone while my thoughts ran in circles. I could feel her presence somewhere behind me, not close enough to touch, but close enough to notice. Close enough to matter. "Do you want some water?" Her voice came gently, pulling me out of my head. I looked up too quickly. Yeah, sure." She gave a small nod and walked toward the kitchen, leaving behind that same quiet shift in the room. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair, trying to shake off the strange tension building in my chest. It didn't work. A moment later, she returned, holding out a glass. I reached for it at the same time she did. Our fingers met. Not sharply. Not awkwardly. Soft. Her fingertips brushed against mine, warm and steady, and for a second, neither of us moved. It wasn't long. Maybe a heartbeat. Maybe less. But it felt longer. Long enough for something unspoken to settle between us. I pulled my hand back first, a little too quickly, wrapping my fingers around the glass as if that would somehow ground me again. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice quieter than I intended. She didn't respond right away. And when I finally looked up, she was already looking at me. Not surprised. Not confused. Just watching. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made my chest tighten again. Something steady. Certain. Like she had noticed everything. Like she understood more than I had ever said out loud. And in that moment, sitting there with the glass still warm in my hands, I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't just in my head anymore. Whatever I had been trying to ignore. She had seen it too. The moment it happened, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no sudden silence, no sharp shift in tone, nothing that would have warned me to prepare for it. It was just the two of us in the kitchen. The house was unusually quiet. My friend had stepped out, and the distant hum of the fan from the other room barely reached us. The light above the counter cast a soft glow, making everything feel closer, more contained, like the world had narrowed down to just this space. I stood near the sink, pretending to focus on nothing in particular, my hands resting against the edge of the counter. I could feel her presence behind me before I even turned around. Still nervous around me. Her voice was calm. Almost casual. I let out a short breath, forcing a small laugh. What? No. Why would I be? Even to my own ears, it sounded off, too quick, too rehearsed. When I turned, she was leaning lightly against the counter across from me, arms loosely crossed. Not defensive. Not closed off. Just, steady. Watching me. That same look again. Not accusing. Not teasing. Just aware. You've been acting different, she said, her tone soft but certain. Quieter. Careful. I shrugged, trying to play it off. I'm always like this. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, not in a way that felt uncomfortable, but in a way that made it impossible to hide. No, she said gently. Not like this. The words didn't hit loudly. They settled. Right in the middle of my chest. I looked away, focusing on the counter, on anything that wasn't her. My fingers tapped lightly against the surface, restless, giving away more than I wanted. For a moment, she didn't say anything. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than any question. Then she moved. Not suddenly. Not enough to startle me. Just a small step forward. But it was enough. The distance between us shifted, noticeably. You know, she said quietly, her voice softer now, you don't have to try so hard to seem untouched by everything. I frowned slightly, glancing back at her. What does that even mean? For a second, she didn't answer. Her gaze held mine, steady, thoughtful, as if she was choosing her words carefully. Then, almost under her breath, but clear enough that I couldn't miss it, you're not as innocent as you pretend, everything inside me went still. Not because she sounded harsh, but because she sounded certain. Like she wasn't guessing. Like she already knew. I felt it immediately, the way my chest tightened, the way my thoughts scattered all at once. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to laugh it off like I had before. But nothing came out right. That's not, I started, then stopped, shaking my head slightly. You're reading too much into it. She didn't argue. Didn't push. She just watched me for a moment longer, and then took another small step closer. Not enough to overwhelm me. Just enough that I became painfully aware of how close she was now. Close enough to notice the calm rhythm of her breathing. Close enough to feel that same quiet warmth radiating from her presence. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, she said softly. And the way she said it, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like understanding. Like she wasn't exposing me to embarrass me, she was simply refusing to pretend she hadn't noticed. I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on the edge of the counter. Because the truth was, she was right. And the hardest part wasn't that she had said it out loud, it was that I could no longer hide behind silence, pretending she hadn't seen straight through me. After that moment in the kitchen, everything should have gone back to normal. At least, that's what I told myself. But normal didn't feel possible anymore. It wasn't anything obvious. No one else would have noticed a difference. The house still sounded the same, conversations still happened the same way, and on the outside, nothing had really changed. But inside, everything had shifted. I became careful. Too careful. I started choosing where I sat, always leaving a little more space than necessary. If she entered a room, I found a reason to leave. If she spoke to me, I kept my answers short, polite, controlled, distant. Like distance could fix something that had already been seen. But the strange part was, she didn't mirror that distance. She didn't avoid me. If anything, she moved exactly the same as before, calm, natural, unbothered. And somehow, that made it harder. Because it meant she wasn't pretending. She would pass by me in the hallway, close enough that the air shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing mine in a way that felt accidental, but happened just often enough to make me question it. Each time, it was brief. A light contact. But it stayed with me longer than it should have. One evening, we ended up in the living room again. My friend had stepped out for a bit, leaving the house quieter than usual. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. The light from the screen flickered softly across the room, mixing with the dim glow of a lamp in the corner. I had already chosen my spot on the couch carefully, toward the edge, leaving enough space beside me to feel safe. Or so I thought. A few seconds later, she walked in. Calm. Unhurried. And without hesitation, she sat down on the same couch. Not right next to me. But not far either. Close enough that I became immediately aware of it. The space between us wasn't empty, it was filled with something quiet, something unspoken. I kept my eyes on the screen, pretending to focus, even though I couldn't have said what was playing. Every sense felt sharper. The faint sound of her breathing. The subtle shift of the couch when she adjusted her position. The quiet presence of her beside me, steady and undeniable. I told myself not to move. Not to react. Just stay still. Stay normal. Then it happened. A small shift, barely noticeable. She adjusted her posture slightly, and her leg brushed against mine. Light. Soft. Not enough to be called intentional. But not something that could be ignored either. I froze. For a split second, my instinct was to pull away. To create space again. To restore that safe distance I had been trying so hard to maintain. But I didn't. And neither did she. The contact stayed. Not pressing. Not forcing. Just there. A quiet connection that neither of us acknowledged out loud. The seconds stretched. Longer than they should have. I could feel the warmth through the fabric, subtle but real, and it made everything else fade into the background. The television noise, the ticking clock, even my own thoughts, they all blurred into something distant. All that remained was that single point of contact. And the silence around it. I risked a glance. She wasn't looking at me directly. Her gaze was on the screen, but her expression was calm, almost thoughtful. There was no tension in her posture, no sign that she felt the need to move away. Like this, was normal to her. Or maybe, like she had already accepted what I was still trying to fight. I swallowed, my hands tightening slightly in my lap. Because the truth was, the distance I had been trying to create, it wasn't working. If anything, it was making everything more obvious. More intense. And sitting there, with that quiet, unbroken contact between us, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit, avoiding her didn't make it disappear. It only made me more aware of how impossible it was to ignore. The tension didn't snap all at once. It built quietly, patiently, until it became impossible to ignore. That evening felt different from the start. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just still. My friend had gone out again, leaving me behind with the excuse that he'd be back soon. I had thought about leaving too. I probably should have. But I didn't. I found myself standing near the window in the living room, staring out at nothing in particular, my thoughts looping the same questions over and over again. Every moment from the past few days replayed in fragments, the kitchen, the couch, the way she looked at me like she already knew. Like she was waiting for me to stop pretending. I heard her before I saw her. Soft footsteps. Unhurried. I didn't turn right away. "You've been quiet again." Her voice came gently, not from far behind me, but closer than I expected. I exhaled slowly, forcing a small shrug as I turned. "Just tired, I guess." It was a weak excuse. We both knew it. She didn't call it out directly. Instead, she stepped a little closer, her expression softer than I had seen it before. There was no trace of teasing now. No curiosity. Just something, careful. "You don't have to do that," she said. I frowned slightly. "Do what?" "Act like everything's normal," she replied, her voice low, steady. "Like you're not thinking about it." The words didn't feel like pressure. They felt like permission. For a moment, I didn't respond. My gaze dropped briefly to the floor, my thoughts searching for something to say that wouldn't give too much away, but wouldn't sound like a lie either. "I don't know what you mean," I muttered, though the hesitation in my voice made it clear I did. She didn't argue. Didn't push. She just closed the space between us slowly, giving me enough time to step back if I wanted to. I didn't. When she reached out, it wasn't sudden. Her hand lifted gently, almost hesitating for a fraction of a second before resting against my arm. The contact was light. Warm. Steady. Not demanding anything. Just there. And somehow, that made it harder to resist. I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen slightly, like my body had been waiting for that grounding touch without realizing it. "You don't have to explain it perfectly," she said softly. "You don't even have to say it out loud." Her thumb moved just slightly against my sleeve, an absent, almost unconscious motion, but it sent a quiet warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. I swallowed, my chest tightening, not with panic this time, but with something closer to release. Because she wasn't trying to expose me. She was trying to understand me. And maybe, she already did. I started, then stopped, shaking my head faintly. "It's not simple." "I know," she replied immediately. That answer came too easily. Like she had already thought about it. Like she had already accepted it. I looked up at her then, really looked this time. There was something different in her expression, not just awareness, but vulnerability. A quiet openness that mirrored what I was feeling, even if neither of us was fully saying it yet. For a moment, everything else faded again. No distractions. No outside noise. Just the space between us, and the truth sitting quietly inside it. I didn't confess. Not completely. But I didn't deny it either. And somehow, that was enough. Because she didn't ask for more. Her hand remained where it was, steady and reassuring, not pulling me forward, but not letting me retreat into silence again either. And in that quiet, shared understanding, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough for me to realize, I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. The moment it finally surfaced didn't feel explosive. There was no raised voice, no sudden rush of words spilling out all at once. It came quietly, like everything else between us had. But this time, it didn't stay hidden. We were standing closer than we ever had before, in that same living room that had somehow become the center of everything. The light was softer now, evening settling in, wrapping the space in a calm that only made my thoughts louder. I could still feel where her hand had rested on my arm just moments ago. Even after she let it fall back to her side, the warmth hadn't faded. Neither had the tension. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. Not after everything. Not after the way she looked at me, like she wasn't asking for the truth anymore, just waiting for me to stop holding it back. I've been trying not to think about it, I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected. She didn't interrupt. Didn't rush me. She just stood there, giving me space, but not distance. And it's not just something small I can ignore, I continued, my gaze dropping briefly before finding its way back to hers. I thought if I just stayed out of the way, it would go back to normal. A faint, almost understanding softness touched her expression. But it didn't, she said gently. I shook my head. No. The word felt heavier than it should have. Because it carried everything I hadn't said. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest. Like we were both standing in it, fully aware of what it meant. I don't expect anything from you, I added quickly, the words coming out a little more rushed now. I just didn't want you to think I was being disrespectful or, you're not. Her response came immediately. Firm, but still soft. It stopped me mid-sentence. I looked at her, surprised by how certain she sounded. There was no hesitation in her eyes. No doubt. Just clarity. And something else beneath it, something warmer. You've been careful, she continued, her voice steady. More careful than you needed to be. That didn't make it easier. If anything, it made everything feel more real. Because she wasn't dismissing it. She wasn't pretending it didn't exist. She was acknowledging it, openly. And that meant I couldn't hide behind uncertainty anymore. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest shifting into something more vulnerable. I didn't know what to do with it, I admitted. That was the closest I had come to saying it outright. And this time, I didn't pull back. She stepped forward then. Not abruptly. Not hesitantly. Just, naturally. Until the space between us disappeared completely. For a brief second, I thought she might say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her arms and wrapped them gently around me. The movement was calm, unhurried, like it had already been decided long before this moment. Her arms settled around me without pressure, just enough to be felt. And then, she leaned in slightly, her cheek resting softly against my chest. Everything inside me stilled. I could feel the warmth of her, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, the subtle rise and fall that grounded the moment in something real. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't rushed. It was calm. And somehow, that made it more intense than anything else could have. My hands hovered for a second, unsure, before slowly settling against her back, returning the embrace just enough to meet her where she was. No more. No less. We stayed like that for a moment that felt longer than it was. Long enough for the tension to shift into something softer. Something understood. But when she pulled back, it wasn't sudden. Her arms loosened gradually, her hands lingering for just a second before falling away. And when I looked at her again, there it was. That quiet conflict in her eyes. Not regret. Not fear. But awareness. Of what this meant. Of what it could become. "This isn't simple," she said softly. The same words I had used earlier. Only now, they carried more weight. Because now, we both understood exactly why. After that night, we didn't fall back into each other. We stepped away. Not dramatically. Not with words that drew a line or defined anything. It just happened. A quiet understanding that things needed space, not to disappear, but to settle. I stopped coming over for a few days. At first, I told myself it was because I was busy. Then I stopped pretending. I needed distance, not from her, but from the intensity of everything I felt when I was around her. Because it wasn't confusion anymore. It was clarity. And that made it harder. I found myself replaying that moment again and again, the way she held me, the calm in her presence, the way nothing felt rushed or wrong in that space, and yet, everything outside of it felt complicated. There were things to think about. Lines that existed whether we wanted them to or not. What it meant for her. For me. For everything around us. But the strange part was, none of those thoughts erased what I felt. If anything, they made it stronger. A few days later, I went back. I didn't plan it. I didn't overthink it. I just found myself standing at the door, knocking before I could talk myself out of it. When she opened it, nothing felt awkward. No tension. No forced smiles. Just a quiet pause, and then a small, natural warmth in her expression. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey." That was it. No mention of what had happened. No immediate attempt to define it. And somehow, that made it easier to breathe. We moved through the house the same way we always had, but slower, more aware of each other in a way that didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt settled. Later, we ended up sitting together again. The same couch. The same room. But this time, the space between us wasn't something I was trying to control. I sat where I wanted to sit. And when she joined me, she didn't hesitate either. She sat closer than before, not testing, not careful. Certain. For a while, we just talked. Normal things. Simple things. But underneath it, there was something deeper, something steady and understood. No more pretending. No more guessing. At one point, the conversation faded naturally, leaving a comfortable silence behind. Not heavy like before. Just calm. I felt it before I saw it. The slight movement of her hand resting near mine. Close enough to notice. Close enough that I knew it wasn't accidental. She didn't rush it. Her fingers shifted slowly, brushing lightly against mine, just enough to give me a choice. Time to pull away. Time to stop it. I didn't. Instead, my hand turned slightly, meeting hers halfway. Our fingers slid together naturally, interlocking without pressure, without urgency. Just fitting. The contact was simple. But it felt more intentional than anything that had come before. Because this time, it wasn't driven by tension. It was a decision. I glanced at her briefly. She wasn't watching me closely like before. Her expression was calm, her gaze soft, but there was something settled in her posture, like she had already made peace with this. With us. Her thumb moved slightly against my hand, a small, absent motion that carried more meaning than words. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to question it. Didn't feel the need to analyze what it meant or where it would lead. Because whatever this was, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't hidden behind confusion anymore. It was quiet, intentional, real. And sitting there beside her, our hands resting together between us, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit before. This wasn't something that had just happened to us. It was something we were choosing. Carefully. Knowingly. Together. The last time I looked at her the same way I used to. I can't even remember when it changed. It didn't happen in one moment. There was no clear ending, no final decision spoken out loud. It was more like a quiet understanding that grew between everything else we had been through, until one day, it simply felt natural. We didn't rush into anything. We didn't need to. Time had already done the work for us. Now, the house felt different, but not in a tense way. In a settled way. Like something that had once been uncertain had finally found its place. I was there again in the evening, sitting in the same living room where everything had started shifting. The light outside was softer now, fading into that calm blue tone that makes everything feel slower. She was in the kitchen for a moment, moving quietly, the familiar sound of a glass being set down, water running briefly, then stopping. Normal sounds. But nothing about it felt ordinary to me anymore. When she walked in, she didn't pause like she used to. She just joined me. Naturally. Like she belonged in that space beside me. She sat close, not carefully this time, not measuring distance. Just, close enough that her presence felt constant without needing attention. I didn't overthink it anymore. That was the biggest change. We talked for a while. Simple things again. Not because we were avoiding anything, but because there was no longer anything to prove or figure out in every silence. And when the conversation faded, it didn't feel empty. It felt complete. At some point, I felt her shift slightly beside me. Not sudden. Not uncertain. Just a small movement that I immediately understood without words. Her hand reached toward mine slowly, resting lightly against my fingers. No hesitation. No question. Just quiet intention. I turned my hand naturally, meeting hers without stopping to think. Our fingers interlocked the same way they had before, but this time, there was no tension in it. No uncertainty hiding underneath. It felt steady. Her thumb moved gently across my hand, a soft, absent motion that grounded everything without needing attention. I looked at her then. Really looked. And what I saw wasn't hesitation anymore. Not confusion. Not conflict. Just calm acceptance. Like she had already made peace with everything that had brought us here. And maybe I had too. She leaned slightly toward me, not fully resting, not leaning in a dramatic way, just enough that her shoulder touched mine. That small point of contact carried more comfort than anything else could have. I didn't move away. Neither did she. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with questions or hidden meanings. It was just there. Warm. Familiar. Safe in a way I didn't know I needed until I felt it. At some point, she spoke softly, not breaking the moment, just existing within it. We don't need to define everything, she said gently. I nodded slightly, understanding more than I could explain. Because she was right. Some things didn't need to be named to exist. Some feelings didn't need to be explained to be real. We stayed like that for a while longer. No urgency. No confusion. No searching for answers that didn't need to be found anymore. Just presence. Just understanding. And in that quiet ending, sitting beside her with our hands still connected and the world outside moving on without us, I realized something simple but important. What we had wasn't something we rushed into. It was something that grew, until it finally felt like home.